May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, 250 years ago, on this weekend, culminated the long march to American independence. You all know your history. In the 1760s, at the close of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, England needed to revise its finances and change its colonial policies. As a result, they enacted new taxes on the colonies here on the eastern seaboard. And the Englishmen that were here would point out the fact that the Magna Carta and other sacred elements of English rights meant that they should have a voice when taxes are levied against them. And yet, the English continued not only with their taxations, but also putting a standing army in Boston. And indeed, eventually putting in their own military government here in this very state. And by April of 1775, the tensions between England and the colonies broke out in violence on the sacred ground of Lexington and Concord, not far from here. And then in June, you had the bloody battle on Breed's Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill. You had the Continental Army being formed. You had the king declaring the colonies in rebellion and prohibiting all foreign trade with them. You had a failed attempt to invade Canada in the winter of 75 and 76. You had the king amassing the largest expeditionary force England had ever mounted in order to bring back the colonies, including the hiring of over 10,000 German mercenaries to help put the boot to the throats of the American colonists. And yet, in spite of all this, the colonies had not declared their independence. And in fact, by the time you get to 1776, the Second Continental Congress was quite divided as to the question of declaring independence. And there were tensions and debates backwards and forwards, seemingly getting nowhere. Part of the problem was a number of the colonial delegations explicitly did not have authority to sign their colonies' names to any declaration. And so in May in 1776, things started to heat up. And John Adams, a representative, a delegate from Massachusetts, ended up pushing through a resolution just barely. They called on each of the colonies to throw off any remaining shackles they had towards under the English crown and establish their own governments. And then on June 7th, famously, Richard Henry Lee, a delegate from Virginia, got up and finally put forth before the body a resolution for independence. It was hotly debated over the next couple of days, and then on June 10th, it was agreed that the resolution would be tabled for 3 weeks. On the 11th, a body of 5 people was appointed to draft a declaration. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman were those 5 gentlemen who got together and drafted the words of our Declaration of Independence. Thankfully, for the cause of independence, by the end of June, winds had shifted. The proprietary governments, the English governments in New Jersey and Pennsylvania were overturned, freeing those delegates to vote for independence. The split delegation in Delaware, there was a man named Caesar Rodney who had cancer and literally rode back from Delaware with cancer so that he could cast the crucial vote for Delaware to vote for independence. By the time July 2nd came around, the vote was 12-0 with 1 abstention. New York State, because of the invading force at its shores, the provincial Congress had to relocate, and they couldn't give their approval until July 10th. But on July 4th, the Congress went ahead, and after some edits to the Declaration, they passed the Declaration of Independence. And you think about it, too, it's the people who signed this, the signers of the original Declaration, when they did that, they knew they were committing an act of treason. And the prospects militarily at that point were not good. Washington was writing that the chances of them defeating the army that was amassing outside New York was slim at best. Morale was low within his own army. What was going to happen? But nevertheless, those signers signed their names, and set us on the course that we're on now. Now, the remarkable thing about the Declaration of Independence is its preamble. And that's really what has garnered the most attention over the years. The various complaints against the king, you can read those through and read the historical background on them, but it's really that beginning part that has been such a defining part of that document and for American history. And that beginning part, as I'm sure you're aware of, Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote it, relied heavily on John Locke in his Second Treatise of Government and a particular political philosophy of his day. And at the core of that philosophy, and I love this, at the core of that philosophy was that every human being, every one of us, has certain rights that are inalienable. They cannot be taken away from us, no matter what. They were given to us by our Creator. Jefferson's language, and indeed that whole tradition, relied on that very passage that Tia read. The revolutionary notion that all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, no matter who they are. This was, as it is today, a radical notion and formed the basis of the Declaration. We have certain rights that are given to us by God because we are made in the image and likeness of God. Now, the philosophy that undergirds Jefferson is this Lockean philosophy. In the 17th and 18th centuries, people were curious about what is the origin of government. And so John Locke said, well, if we want to imagine a time when no government existed, theoretically, a state of nature, people came together to protect both their liberty and property. And in so doing, they gave up a portion of their liberty and property to protect the rest of it. So, for instance, when you come together as a government, you give up the liberty of being able to kill someone without consequence. You're like, okay, I'm giving up that freedom. I'm no longer able to do that. I'm no longer able to just steal from people as much as I want, as long as we all agree on that. And I'll give a portion of my property to enforce those so that I can maintain the rest of my liberties and my properties. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the interesting thing about this, as I was thinking about it this past week, what does one say about the Declaration of Independence? One thing that struck me was just the irony of the document. And this can be lost on us sometimes, the irony of this. You had these people in the 18th century who based this document on political philosophy. It is an elitist group getting together. These are people who went to college. Do you realize how few people went to college back then? These are people who had a lot of money. These people who were prominent, who got together and formed this document. And in so doing, they unleashed these forces that were distinctly anti-elitist. I find this ironic. This group of wealthy, highly educated elites unleashed this democratic fervor within the United States. If you're someone who likes to read history books, like me, you may have read Gordon Wood's Radicalism of the American Revolution, which came out in 1992 and won the Pulitzer Prize. What Wood argues is that as a result of the revolution, you actually had an overturning of the entire social structure that existed before. Before the revolution, you would tip your hat to your betters. There was this whole sense of a hierarchy of society. Not every gentleman could be called Mr. That was only reserved for those whom society deemed deserved that right. There was an order of things that they inherited from the English. The revolution turned that all upside down. Within 20 or 30 years, there were calls for equality, for greater franchise, for more people voting, and certainly everyone, all the gentlemen, all the men in the country would say, no, I deserve to be called Mr. too. This elitist document, this elitist group of people unleashed this incredible democratic fervor. My favorite book on the history of American religion is The Democratization of American Christianity by Nathan Hatch. And Hatch argues that this same democratizing fervor that was unleashed by the Declaration of Independence transformed American religion. We are the inheritors of the Second Great Awakening. Before that, each colony had its own established religion, and there was a proper way of doing things, a proper hierarchy. The Second Great Awakening tossed that all out the window, gave us a free market of religion. Part of that was also an anti-intellectual strand within America that we have to wrestle with even today. Those Congregationalists, those elitist Congregationalists, why should I listen to them just because they went to fancy places like Harvard? I can read the Bible for myself. This transformed the United States. The ultimate expression of this being the abolition of slavery. You read any of the documents leading up to the abolition of slavery, and almost every one of them quotes the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. This incredible democratizing trend. It's one of these great ironies in the document. But there's another irony that I think is more relevant for us today. And that is that the document itself embodies a liberal, in the old sense of the word, notion of government. What we today would call libertarian. This whole Lockean liberalism is you should be allowed to do whatever you want so long as it doesn't harm someone else in society. Jefferson himself famously said, "The government which governs least governs best." You have this libertarian notion that's enshrined in this preamble. But the Declaration also unleashed democracy, and in democracy, people can vote for things that are different. And these tensions we have inherited throughout our country's history. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson, of all people, used federal tax dollars to purchase the Louisiana Purchase, which people said at the time was unconstitutional. This is outside, you don't have the ability to do this. Government is having an overreach by purchasing this land. The first great debates in the 1820s and 30s, you had the pro-business group wanting a stronger federal government, wanting big government. Think about that. The initial big government people were all pro-business. The so-called Whig Party, strong here, with high tariffs, internal improvements, a national banking system, against states' rights and nullification. Again, this tension between what are people voting into office versus libertarian background. During the American Civil War, the exigencies of war led to the income tax, which was seen as being so questionable at the time that we had to pass an amendment to even make it happen in the early 20th century. There was a draft, violations of civil rights. These are not libertarian principles. In the earlier part of the 20th century, the progressive movement had a different sort of philosophy on government, where all of a sudden it's government's job to protect citizens by having the Food and Drug Administration, by breaking up monopolies, by having regulations about business conditions. This is not libertarian. The Great Depression led to an entirely different view on the federal government, that it's the federal government's job to promote the general welfare. And then, of course, in the 70s and 80s, you have this backlash against that. And today we have this mishmash of political philosophies. No longer are these boundaries clear. We have the party in power who's advocating tariffs taking over private enterprise. One of the things that strikes me is that, unlike in the time of the Declaration of Independence, where we had the capacity to say, people can get together and talk about political philosophy, imagine having an equivalent convention today. Do you think any of our leaders would be like, oh yeah, let's talk about political philosophy? What political philosophy do we have that's actually relevant that we can talk about today? I'm one of these people that wishes we had better political philosophers writing about this stuff. If we ever need good political philosophy, it's now. Because the political philosophy enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, that libertarian viewpoint has been overturned by 250 years of democracy. And part of the problems that plague us today are confusion about what government's role should be, what is government, what are the rights of the people. These things are as vague as they ever were. And it leads to issues. Now, I am not going to get up here and try and propose a new political philosophy. I am not a political philosopher, thank goodness. But I am a preacher. And so whereas I can't put forth a political philosophy that might govern us in this next 250 years, or at least in the near future, what I can do is say, as Christians, there are certain principles that we can rely on in our public sphere that we can rely on as our own personal political philosophy, guided by our faith, to live into the principles of our democracy today, in this time, in this moment. And for me, the most basic thing is that passage that Tia read earlier. That Christians can say unequivocally that every single human being is made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore deserves dignity. I wish that wasn't such a revolutionary concept, but it is. Every single person. I don't care if you're a criminal or not. I don't care what country you're from or not. I don't care what political party you have or not. Every single person. It is an inalienable right. Everybody deserves dignity. Believing that everyone is made in the image and likeness of God reinforces our democracy. There are those in this country on both the right and the left that would rather have their view win out than democracy win out. But I believe that every single person is made in the image and likeness of God, and they should all have a voice. And we should listen to those voices. And also encourage people to think for themselves, individual responsibility. The early Congregationalists were the very first people in the world to pass the Public Education Act because we wanted everyone to think for themselves. Because everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. They have that rational ability. So that's the first thing I would say. For a religious political philosophy in this day and age, can we hold on to Genesis 1? A second thing, and this is something the revolutionary people would love, and that is virtue. You read any of the stuff from the revolutionary period, and they said one of the great dangers of a democratic republic is that it only exists, it only is healthy if the people are virtuous. That's why you had this checks and balances within the Constitution, because there was this fear that people weren't going to be virtuous. Virtue matters. What does that look like for a Christian? One, you say that there's a moral law in the universe, and that we should try as best we can to hold ourselves accountable to that and to hold others accountable to that. Another thing within this sort of seeking after virtue is to set aside self-interest. This is the core of Christianity. It's not a good thing to get up and say with Gordon Gekko that greed is good. A Christian would say that's not true. Self-interest is not good. You look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, what do they say? One, those who are downtrodden, those who are the Anawim in Hebrew, need to be cared for. It's part of virtue as a Christian. Being suspicious of those in power. It goes throughout the Old and New Testaments. And mercy and compassion above all else. These are the virtues that form the basis of Christian citizenship. And the final thing I would say is confession. People of Israel messed up all the time in the Hebrew Bible. It's one long account of how the people of Israel had messed up again and again and again. But they were still the chosen people. As Christians, we're called on to confess our sins. Point out where we messed up. And the same thing is true with our nation. It is a good and healthy thing to reckon with our sinfulness as a nation, as a people. And what we see today is people going too far in the other direction on both sides. Some people claiming that the United States has no faults and we're the exceptional nation and we're perfect in every way. That type of arrogance is poisonous and bad and unchristian. At the same time, other people are so caught up in the faults and negatives of American history and the faults that we've made that they lose sight of the good things too. We are a flawed people, of course, but we're also people who've done a lot of good. And you can hold those things in tension if you're a Christian. That would be my challenge to all of us in the midst of this topsy-turvy political philosophy world, unleashed by the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago. In the midst of this confusing world, can we hold on to our Christian principles to be good citizens today? To respect that every single person is made in the image and likeness of God. To strive for virtue, especially setting aside self-interest and being compassionate. following the moral order of the universe? And can we also embrace the virtue of confession as a nation and as individuals? In spite of some people having ambivalence about our nation's anniversary, I really don't. Because when I look at the history of the United States, I choose to lift up, say, for instance, the sacrifices that people made during the American Revolution. When you read about how much people had to give up, how many people died, how much destruction there was in this land to bring about our independence, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for the sacrifices throughout American history that I'm an inheritor of. Other people before me have made sacrifices for the greater good to make this country what it is. And so on this 250th anniversary, I choose to remember that. I choose to hold on to that gratitude. I also believe firmly that even though we've gone through lots of errors and ups and downs, I do believe that God's presence has been with us in various ways. And my prayer is, as we go forward in this time, that God can continue to bless the United States of America.